All right. Hello, and welcome to the Coaches Workshop on Disadvantages with Chicago Debates. So the introductions, I'm Victoria. I'm a program officer for school support at Chicago Debates, and I will be leading this workshop on disadvantages. This is just an kind of introductory view with some more advanced stuff at the end, and then we'll be posting the slides and different resources for our coaches to use. Brings us to, what are these workshops? Why are we doing this? So I always like to start off with the why question. At Chicago Debates, we're very driven by the why and the reasons why we do our programs, our help our coaches choose our schools. All of those things are driven by our why and our mission. So the goals and mission of these workshops is really first of all, the empowerment of coaches. We want to give the coaches the tools to be able to teach this material to their students and to have a basic understanding of policy debate. Unlike a lot of subjects, debate coaches often have never had a class or a background in policy debate. But unlike a science teacher who has had many science courses and knows how to teach science, debate coaches don't always know the concepts even of debate. And so that's what we want to do in these workshops, is to really empower the coaches and give everyone the tools. Secondly is the resources. Our resource page will include a lot of different resources related to the workshop. So that could be obviously the slide decks and the videos, but also different activities and different blog posts, videos, whatever else we think might be a possible useful resource for our coaches. The third is just to create material for our coaches. Part of the goal of these workshops are to record them and have them to be able to be useful for our coaches and just have a video library, something that we've been lacking, but we want to provide to our coaches. And fourth is a way for us to support our coaches better, help fill in some of those gaps, and really, again, empower our coaches. So that's our why of these workshops. So for this workshop, we'll be talking about the disadvantage. First, we'll be covering what a disadvantage is, the different types. Second, the structure. We'll be going over the 4 parts. And then the affirmative strategies, how you answer a disadvantage. And then we'll be moving to the speech by speech, how the process of a disadvantage works throughout the whole debate. And then we'll have the more advanced topics on disadvantage, which will be making it work. How does a disadvantage link or work with a different affirmative? Second is extra impacts. We'll talk about how to add in extra impacts and spice up your disadvantage. Third will be the impact calculus. How do you win on a disadvantage? And how do you, if you're affirmative, not lose on a disadvantage? And lastly, we'll be talking about disadvantages as a net benefit, and we'll talk about and learn what that means, how to use them with counterplans, tell you what that's about. And we'll also talk about the politics DA, which is very often a net benefit. But just to clarify that disadvantages, disad, DA all mean the same thing. In policy debate, we really like to use just a letter or two to refer to a whole set of arguments. So when you'll see DA or disad throughout this lecture and throughout this workshop, that's what it will be. So overview. What is a disadvantage? So a disadvantage is a key negative position, and it's a major source of impacts for a negative team. It's how they get something external. It's how, when we talk about impact calculus, we very often are talking about the disadvantage when we're talking about it in the context of the negative team. What it is in generality is that it's the affirmative plan causes something bad to happen. It's unrelated to the affirmative advantages. So it's something external to the plan. It's an unintended consequence, if you will, of passing the affirmative plan. So what are some common disadvantages? Only talked about it in the abstract. So these aren't any official categories. There are no official categories of disadvantages, no matter how hard I looked and asked all my debate friends. But the first type is the more political one, so the politics advantage, which could be about the agenda, being legislative agenda of Congress / political capital. And we'll talk about that at the end. Or an elections disadvantage, both for midterm elections and presidential elections. It could be about the economy. So that's where you'll see the spending type of DAs, that the plan costs a lot of money and that's bad, or job/industry DAs. So like on the immigration topic, immigration taking jobs was a huge disadvantage, or different industries are affected in different ways. That's another big area of disadvantages. A trade-off. All disadvantages in some way are trade-off, but when one thing trades off with the other, that's the trade-off disadvantage. So it could be budget focused, or it could be just focus. The focus of, political capital or diplomatic capital, that focus of diplomats maybe changes. And then there are two types of debate topics. So there's domestic and international topics. So in domestic topics, you'll see the federalism disadvantage a lot as a core negative position, which is about the balance of federal and state power. And then on international topics, you'll see disadvantages related to United States alliances, related to relations with other countries. In military-centered topics, you'll see disadvantages related to deterrence, or the idea that U.S. military power is able to prevent different wars, with things such as like mutually assured destruction and alliance commitments and things like that. Those are kind of some of these disadvantages that you'll start to see in policy debate. It depends somewhat on the topic, what sort of disadvantages make sense and exist in the literature base, but here are some, just ideas and some of the areas that we see disadvantages. So now, exciting part, the different parts of a disadvantage. So there are 4 parts to a disadvantage. The first is uniqueness. So uniqueness is a snapshot of the status quo, as it's called, meaning what's happening right now. So uniqueness describes the world as it is without the affirmative plan. And the link is how the affirmative causes something to happen, how it changes the status quo, how it changes the story given in the uniqueness. So generic topic links sometimes work. So on this year's topic, that criminal justice reform might change the balance between federal and state power, for example, with the federalism disadvantage. It's how that link changes something. Or it could be very specific affirmative questions. So maybe it's about how police body cameras specifically change that power. And then after your link, how that affirmative changes that. Why is that change bad is your internal link. What does that cause? Why, in this example of federalism, why is that state power so important? That's the question the internal link asked, is how does the F cause some impact? Why is it bad? And then the impact is the overarching bad thing that happens. It is often war or some horrible environmental impact or something that causes basically a lot of death in case of policy debate. So it's why is that thing really bad and why do we care? As I talked about in the Debate 101 lecture, if you watch that the impact is really what makes us all care. Here's some examples that no one really cared about global warming until we realized the absolutely devastating impacts that it could possibly have. And so that's what the impact is doing, is telling the judge why they should care. Why is this a big enough deal to take action right now? Or in the case of a disadvantage, not take action. Why does this outweigh the possible benefits of the affirmative plan? And so now some simple examples of disadvantages that we're going to walk through, if anyone here wants to also add some. So the question is, so we'll start off with some silly ones. So if the question is, or the affirmative is, I should go to McDonald's for dinner, what would be some of the disadvantages? I don't know if anyone's gonna responses, but some of the possible disadvantages of, say, going to McDonald's for dinner, so like trade-off. Maybe it's you would rather go to Sonic for dinner. If you're going for McDonald's, you can't do that. So it's a trade-off disadvantage. Or maybe you're thinking about the health benefits, or like the health drawbacks, right? And so maybe the disadvantage to that would be that the health impact, right? The obesity impact. That would be like a topic-specific disadvantage, right? And so that another example, another topic, say the affirmative, is a student should stay up late to finish their homework. One disadvantage is that they wouldn't get enough sleep. So you start with the uniqueness. Students will get enough sleep now. Staying up to finish homework or the affirmative changes that. The lack of sleep leads to a worse performance on the test in algebra class. And then the impact, which is that then they'll fail that algebra exam. Right? That's how a disadvantage would work. And that's how you start looking at topics and moving into disadvantages. That's how you go from this is the affirmative to, oh, this is this big external argument I can make when I'm negative. Now, some policy examples, right? So college should be free in America. Right? So possible disadvantage here would be an economy-based disadvantage about the cost. Another disadvantage would be a trade-off disadvantage about other occupations. Maybe it trades off with the military and trades off with trade schools, and maybe it trades off with various parts of the workforce. Like that would be a disadvantage. That'd be an economy and industry-based disadvantage. Another example is the United States military should remove military presence from Japan. So then that would be when we saw like the alliance disadvantage, that it would affect our alliance and our relationships. We also might see a trade-off disadvantage with the trade-off between United States military power and maybe China's military power, and maybe that's bad. So that's kind of how you start thinking about these disadvantages and start thinking about disadvantages and kind of everyday proposals and how that translates to a debate disadvantage. At the core, a very simple, just external reason why you shouldn't do the plan with a really big impact. And so that's really the importance of disadvantages. And having your students read these as it helps them think about these like real life disadvantages. What external impact am I not thinking about? What am I not considering? And that's the question that disadvantages ask. And that's some of the kind of portable skills we get when we read and research disadvantages. We start thinking about what external impact could this cause? So now the affirmative, answering a disadvantage. So we'll first be talking about defense. I personally think of debate similar to how I think about football, that you need both offense and defense. And so whenever you're affirmative, and the negative just read a disadvantage with the 4 parts of uniqueness, link, internal link, and impact, that it's important to have both defense and offense, just like you need to win a football game. So first, looking at the defense. The defense is about stopping the play at any level possible. Like football, you can either first go after the quarterback, maybe you want to break up the pass, maybe you want to tackle the receiver once they get that pass. Just like the defense in football, there's many different ways and many different places where you can stop the run, where you can stop the pass. And so just like that, debate is like that with a disadvantage as well. So the first is non-unique, stop it at its very source. This would be like a sack in football. Just say that what the negative painted the status quo, what they painted the current picture and the world is not true. The second is no link. Our affirmative really doesn't change that at all. It's like breaking up the pass. There's also an argument of uniqueness overwhelms the link, which is that it's so unique, it's going to happen anyway. We're just a drop in the bucket. We don't change that. We are not a big enough change in the world to change this thing that is so certain. Like they just painted the world, and that is just a true. That's just true. And there's nothing that's going to change that, including our affirmative. Third thing is the no internal link. So this is kind of if you're breaking the pass right before, not knocking it down, but breaking it up before it gets to the impact of getting to the receiver. This is that they said that this change would hurt the economy, but it doesn't. And this is how. And then the no impact is making sure the receiver doesn't get a touchdown, right? Trying to tackle them right before or a first down. And so this is the no impact, that economic decline maybe doesn't cause any war. There's no impact. There's no reason to vote on this disadvantage. And now the affirmative strategies answer data that are offensive. So again, like football, you have the offense as well. So the offense of a disadvantage really turns a disadvantage into an advantage. We made it our own advantage. Like, no, this is actually a reason to do the plan. That's what the offensive strategy is. Something that turns the DA. Says the story is so wrong. So the first way to say the opposite is true. There's a typo. I'll fix it. And first is a link turn. But to do a link turn, you also need to say the inverse of uniqueness is true, because otherwise it's like something's going to happen. We just make it happen more. It doesn't make sense. So you need it to be, no, something's not about to happen. It's not about to happen, and we cause it to happen. So that's why with a link turn, you need both uniqueness and link there. Just because you make something happen more that's already going to happen, that doesn't get you anywhere. So that's why you need both. There's also the internal link turn. No, we don't hurt the economy. We actually help the economy. And there's the impact turn, which is the impact that they say is bad is not actually bad at all. Like, we actually like destroying the economy because it like saves the environment or something. And so one big piece of advice here, be careful with your offense. Don't double turn yourself. So don't say that this isn't going to happen, we make it happen, and that thing is bad. Because then it means you just caused a bad thing. So you don't want that at all. So you want to be careful not to double turn yourself here on a disadvantage. That's a very important mistake to avoid. So now let's talk about the speech by cease process and how a debate for and against a disadvantage changes throughout the debate round. So on the 1AC, so the first negative speech, so the 1AC has read the 1AC, the disadvantage does not appear yet. Because remember, it's unrelated to the affirmative plan, which means it won't appear in the 1AC. So the first speech in which a disadvantage appears is the 1AC, or the first negative constructive. So you'll read the shell, as it's called. It'll be called that core files. We call that in files. So it's the 1AC shell, which means it's the way to introduce the argument. It's like, the shell of a nut, that it covers a lot of the arguments here, but it covers it in totality, but there's a lot else there. And we'll get to like the meat, the nut of the disad. But the shell is what is first introduced into the debate. Just because in the 1AC, you also have to answer the affirmative. So once you just have that thin layering of the disadvantage as a nutshell. So it's normally 3 to 4 cards. Sometimes parts of the disadvantage will be combined. Maybe the internal link and link will be combined, which is okay. But it'll be either 3 or 4 cards, off with a uniqueness card, link card, internal link card, and impact card. It'll be highlighted down, or parts of the card will be, the 3 to 4 cards will be highlighted. Be sure to highlight this from the core files or any file that you're reading from, because that will allow you to more efficiently read the disadvantage. Again, make sure that your warrants are included in that. And then you'll replace the generic link if you need to. Our middle school core files are set up such that the shell is completely ready for whatever affirmative you're debating. But in high school, there will be a generic link that you can read on any affirmative in the topic. But if you have a piece of evidence that's more specific to the affirmative, it's greatly to your advantage to replace that card in the 1AC. There's no reason you need to read both the more generic link and the more specific link. So just read the specific link there. Now the 2AC, the debate really starts happening. For the 2AC, you read your 2AC block, which should be pre-written. And if not, we'll talk about how to do that. What should that include? But you'll have to make adjustments based on what the shell read. Like, what was the actual story? What was the impact that was read? A lot of disadvantages have the same name, but they are different. They're not the same exact disadvantage. Often you see a more generic disadvantage, say the politics disadvantage, which we'll get to in a moment. And there's a lot of different stories. There's a lot of different impacts, a lot of different bills it's talking about. So you don't want to just read your 2AC block on the politics disadvantage, because you might be answering an entirely different disadvantage. You don't want that. So be sure to pay attention and be sure to make sure that the story that you're reading in the 2AC really lines up with what the 1AC read. And so then you want a mix of offense and defense. This is a question of what should go in my 2AC block. So if you go back and look at the defensive arguments and the offensive arguments, you want a nice combination of those two. It's a lot harder to win a disadvantage if you're affirmative, or I guess not lose to it, if you just have a bunch of defensive arguments. If you kind of a death by 1,000 cuts is what we often refer to it as debate judges. It's a lot harder versus if you have some offense. That really helps. And you also want to use analytical arguments. So just arguments you make up on the fly to attack the link chains. Use history to disprove it. Has the economy gone down before and we haven't seen a war? Have these sort of plans and affirmatives happened before and we haven't seen this bad thing happen? Is the link story not true? Think of alternative causes that the disadvantage can't solve, which means it's going to either happen anyway or won't happen at all. And think about how the affirmative, especially the impact level, really affects the DA story. How do you interact with it? So it's not just how the disadvantage works in the status quo, but how would the disadvantage work in the world of the affirmative? What have you changed that affects the story and the link chain of the disadvantage? So don't be afraid to just make smart arguments on disadvantages. Disadvantages often have very weak link chains, and you want to exploit that. You want to get some real defense, especially off of just making smart arguments. They don't have to have evidence. Just make smart arguments. And now for the block. We all know that both the 2 in C and 1 in R, because they don't have an affirmative speech in between them, that they're considered kind of one speech, if you will, given my 2 different partners. And so at one point in this negative block, one of the speeches, the negative team will cover the disadvantage. Which is case in one disadvantage, you'll see that 1 in R takes the disadvantage. And so what you want to do, because you have more speech time than the affirmative just did, is you want to answer everything the 2AC block said. Very important. Answer everything the 2AC said, not just the cards, but answer the analytic arguments as well. So be sure that you have a really careful flow of the arguments that the affirmative made so you can answer all of them. Second is that you should read cards to strengthen the 1AC arguments and any you need to answer new arguments made by the 2AC. You don't want to read the same cards as the 1 in C bet, though. That doesn't help you. You're much better off to just explain the arguments made in the 1 in C evidence than reading the same evidence over again. The judge already heard it. They don't need to hear that evidence again. So use that time to make new arguments. You can also read different impact modules if there's a different impact that can be caused by the disadvantage. So with the federalism disadvantage on the high school level, we have an extra state empowerment is important to solve global warming impact, right? And so maybe in the block, you want to expand the breadth of your disadvantage. Maybe the affirmative really attacked your impact really well. Maybe you just want to expand what you can go for in the end of the debate. So that's why these impact modules exist, mostly on the high school level because of time constraints, but that's a really important tool in the block has. And you also want to explain, whether with cards or just with smart arguments, how the disadvantage turns or solves the case. How does the disadvantage access the impacts of the affirmative? How do you solve for the impacts that the affirmative is going to go for? Why they say they're going to outweigh? How does the DA actually solve for those problems that they said exist in the world? Next is the 1AR. 1AR is a very time-crunched speech. So you want to pick the best arguments against the disadvantage. When I was a 1A, I always liked to circle them on my flow. I had a different color pen, so maybe a red pen or a purple pen, and I would circle the best arguments that the 2AC made. I would talk to my partner, the 2A, and be like, okay, what arguments must I go for on this flow? And if everyone has good flows and everyone's carefully taking notes, as we should be, that's going to be really easy. Your partner and you, before the 1AR, can say, okay, these are the best 3 arguments, I think. So be sure you can get to these. Even if you have more time, say more arguments the 2AC made. But if not, these are the 3 arguments you need to make. That will really help your 1AR be efficient and make sure that you have plenty of both offense and defense on the disadvantage. Be sure to extend the arguments, not just the tags. An argument is more than just the tag of the evidence or the short headline, right? Just like an article you read online, it's not just the headline. There's a reason that when you're reading news stories, you don't just read headline after headline after headline. You're like, okay, I know everything. I've read the news. Just like that. In debate, you don't want to just tell the judge headline after headline and say, okay, I've debated, because that's not what debate is. It's about explaining the warrants as well. And maybe in high school, read a new card. If they read a new impact, then yes, read a new card. But otherwise, a discretion, obviously, sometimes in higher level debates, you see 1AR having to read a new card, but probably shouldn't. Just because it's not an efficient use of time. You're honestly better off just extending and explaining, spending more time explaining those arguments that your partner made in the 2AC. Rebuttal becomes a little too late to make those new arguments. And the 2NR. You decide to go for the DA, which means that this is the focus of the 2NR. These are the impacts that are going to win you to the debate round. So you should only go for one disadvantage in your disadvantages. A little bit we'll talk about what do you do when you have more than one disadvantage in the block. What do you do? But you should only go for one. You should start when you go to the disadvantage flow by telling the story of the disadvantage. You don't want to have choppy, they say, we say, just talking about the arguments. You want to really lay out how this happens, right? Remind the judge the uniqueness. Remind the judge the link and the internal link and the impact. How does the affirmative cause this to happen? You don't want to just yell at them that the impact is really bad. Avoid nuclear war. Nuclear war is bad. Your judge knows nuclear war is bad. But you have to explain how the affirmative causes it. Why is this not just bad, but why is this a reason to reject the affirmative plan? That's what telling the story in the 2NR really does. It reminds the judge why the disadvantage is a reason to vote against the affirmative plan. Not just that nuclear war is bad, like a judge remembers that. But the question is, how do we get there? Why do we care about this impact? Why is it not just some obscure thing you brought up? Why does it matter in this debate? You should do impact calculus. Explain why the impact of the disadvantage matters more than anything the affirmative is about to say. In a few weeks, we'll have the impact comparison lecture. And so I think Dr. Nelson will be talking about going for disadvantages and how to win that impact calculus. But the impact calculus is so important. Why is that impact more important than anything the F says? And the question is, how do you access the affirmative advantage? The defense case arguments we talked about. This is extra strong because not only do you outweigh or have bigger impact than the affirmative, but you also are able to access their impacts, which means there's no way you don't win. You have to ask, how does this dissad possibly turn the case? Again, even if they're analytical arguments, even if you don't have cards, these are some of the arguments you should be making. You have to ask, why does the dissad outweigh the case? And lastly, as you should be asking in any 2NR and any speech, if they win their best arguments, how do I still win the debate? So frame your impacts like that. Frame your 2NR like, even if they win the affirmative, this is why the disadvantage is more important. This is how I still win. So that's what you want your 2NR to be. So now we're at the 2AR. The 2NR just went for the disadvantage, and you have to negate it. You have to, not lose on the disadvantage because then you win on your affirmative. So you want to extend parts of your offense and defense that your partner extended in the 1AR. And we understand that the 1AR, because it's time crunched, might not have said everything you said in the 2AC. However, in the 2AR, it is a rebuttal, and you should continue to only extend the arguments made in the 1AR. That's why it's so important to sit down with your 1A before the 1AR and say, these are the 3 arguments or 4 arguments I want you to make, because that's the bank of arguments that you can make in the 2AR. You can expand further upon those arguments, as you should be doing. Again, explain the arguments, not just read the headline to your judge, but really explain them. But those are the only arguments you could be making. And you want to say, how does the case solve the impacts of the disadvantage? So how does the economy flow over here mean that our alliances are strong on the disadvantage, for example? How are these interconnected? And those are the questions you want to be asking. And then how does the case outweigh the impacts of the DA? If the disadvantage is true, why should you still pass the plan? Some things are good and they might have a minor ill effect, but you still take it, right? Even if antibiotics make you not feel good, they still ultimately solve a much bigger problem, so you still take them, right? It's like drug side effects. Why is the disadvantage just the side effect of a really good drug, right? And so that's what you should be asking. And that's all wrapped up in the impact calculus. Why does your impact of the affirmative, your advantage impacts, matter way more and outweigh way more of the disadvantage? So think of the disadvantage as side effects of a drug. Why are we still taking that drug? Why are we still passing the plan, even if there are side effects? So that's what you want your impact calculus to be. Now, right at 30 minutes, will be the more advanced strategies of a disadvantage. Yes, okay. So this is making it work, turning it from a more generic strategy to an app-specific strategy. And then we'll be talking about the extra impacts, impact calculus, and DA as a net benefit. So yes, this is the same slide as before. This is just a refresher as for this part of the workshop. Making it link. Choosing the right link to the affirmative, which is really important. If you have, again, a 1NC link that is better than the generic one, you should absolutely be reading it here, because you don't want the 2AC to be able to say that this is just a generic impact or that the block is too late to read a specific impact. You want to start off with the relevancy of your disadvantage. And whenever you're producing a disadvantage or writing your own disadvantage, you want to look for as many specific links to the affirmative. You both want a very generic topic link you could read against any case, but you also want as many specific links as possible. And then another way to make the disadvantage link is sometimes you have very affirmative specific disadvantages. Another typo. Well, supposed to be affirmative specific disadvantages, which could be read against one affirmative or maybe one type of affirmative. So on this year's topic, maybe you have a policing disadvantage about maybe police unions, right? Which could be read on any police affirmative. But you wouldn't read that against a forensic science affirmative, for example, right? So this is more of an affirmative specific disadvantage. Which are really useful because the literature is just going to be so specific and so good. And it's going to be really, really hard, not impossible, for that affirmative to make no link arguments or link turn it if it's just more of a true disadvantage that exists in the literature. So it's useful to have kind of your core disadvantages that have generic links and you can have a specific link. That's very useful for you to have kind of one literature base that you know super well as a negative, as kind of your core negative strategy. But it's also useful to have a hyper-specific disadvantage to get kind of that strategic advantage that's going to link really well and really be able to access the impacts of the case super well. So those are kind of two different strategies of disadvantages, and often you'll be reading some of both. You don't have to be one type of team or the other. There are reasons to read core disadvantages because you know that debate really well. Instead of doing it once at a tournament, you do it maybe 3 times a tournament. And then there's the more affirmative specific, which is have strategic impacts within that specific round. And now the extra impacts. I'm expanding just from the 1NC. So extra impact modules, we talked about some in the 2NC. This is when you read this, again, is the block impacts. But to gain extra offense. Maybe the affirmative has so many different advantage areas, or you feel like you're just behind on something. Maybe they really did a great job of attacking the 1NC impact against that extra offense that you might need. Or it also catches the 1AR off guard. If you have a big impact, it means the 1AR has to probably read a new card. So maybe you don't know how much the 1A is really listening. So you drop in a little impact. See if they don't catch it. And if they don't catch it, then you blow that up huge in the 2NR. So it gives you that kind of extra opportunity to make the 1AR, which is already a time press speech, but to make it even harder by putting an extra impact in the disadvantage. And then you want to also think about how it turns case. Read cards or just make arguments about how the disadvantage turns the case or accesses each of the impacts of the affirmative advantage. Your block will be much better off if you sit down and think, what are each of the impacts of the 1AC? What are the app's advantages? How can I possibly make some argument, even if it's, not the best argument in the world? How can I cause some explanation that the disadvantage is able to reach those? How can our impact of the disadvantage or the story of the disadvantage, how can it possibly affect the affirmative? Because that will put you in such a better place to do impact comparison if you can access their impacts, because then they have no leverage over you. Next, of course, is impact calculus, like specifically, which we talked about, kind of throughout this, but kind of serves its own slide because it's so important. The impact calculus for the true and R is the most important. You really want to talk about why the disadvantage outweighs and turns the case. That should be the overview of the true and R, is that the disad outweighs and turns the case. And then explain how. Don't just say those words. Actually explain to the judge what that means. Again, no one learns the news by just reading headlines. Similar to that, no debate judge is going to vote for you just because you read headlines at them. Then secondly, the impact calculus of the 2AR against the disadvantage. You can't just talk about your affirmative. If the 2 and R goes for disadvantage, you have to address the disadvantage and the 2 and R. More importantly, you have to talk about how the affirmative outweighs that disadvantage. Why is it more important? Again, why is it like side effects of a medication that you still want to take for these reasons, right? And why is that so much more important, even if the side effects are bad, right? Like, why do you still vote affirmative? And so the impact calculus in those last two speeches are so important. Now, the 1AR and the block can start setting up these impact calculuses, right? You should really start setting up, talking about why your impact matters and why it matters most and why it, outweighs and turns the case. Like, you should start saying those words in the block. But the last two speeches are really the important points to be able to drive home those comparisons. The impact should be set up in the prior speeches, but those like comparisons in the calculus, like that's so important to harp on in the last speech. Because the question of the last two speeches are, why do I win this debate? And you want the judge to have a clear and concise answer to why you win the debate. And the impact calculus of your disadvantage, when you're negative, is how you do that. Next thing, it's a very advanced topic, which is about the disadvantage of net benefit. It's the additional strategic advantage of reading a debate around. So a disadvantage doesn't always just have to win as a disadvantage. One way to win reading disadvantage is as a net benefit of the counterplan. It's an additional reason to prefer the counterplan to the affirmative's plan. So let's say you're reading a counterplan, which is an alternative plan to the affirmative plan. And next week, Flynn will be talking more about counterplans. But the disadvantage specifically is a reason to prefer the counterplan over the affirmative. So it's something the affirmative causes, but the counterplan does not. That's what makes it a net benefit. So that's a real power of choosing a disadvantage. So when you're choosing a disadvantage to read and you're reading a counterplan, you want to ask yourself, is this a net benefit? Which means, is this something that the affirmative causes, that there's a link to the affirmative, but is not caused by the counterplan, right? So in this example, like this year, there's a lot of different states counterplans, and they say federalism disadvantage about the balance between state and federal power. So if the federal government does the plan, which is the affirmative, definitely disrupts that power, the power of the states. But if the states do the plan, that does not, because again, the argument is that the states should do it. And so that is a net benefit. It's something that the affirmative causes, but the counterplan does not. And so that is a very strategic advantage of reading disadvantages, is that it can be a reason to win your counterplan. And that is a huge use of disadvantages in the round. And really, again, sets up why the disadvantage outweighs the case, is because your world solves the case and has this additional disadvantage. So, any risk of winning the disadvantage means you win the debate, which is a huge power of a disadvantage, is reading it as a net benefit. And one of the most common net benefits in debate, I am very excited that this will be hopefully coming back a little bit stronger now in a Biden administration. So the political capital disadvantage, which I think is a special, very debatey disadvantage that should be talked about. So there's the second line here is kind of a joke amongst debaters that the politics disadvantage is such an important part of debate, and especially like before Trump presidency was very just simply because in the past, political capital, this theory has mattered more for legislative agendas than it does right now. But with the Biden presidency, it's going to matter more again. And so we call it polycap disadvantage, politics, P-ticks, ticks, again, different spelling of ticks. Debaters can't spell. Anyone who's seen critique spelled the weirdest way possible, starting with a K, you'll know that debaters spell things really weird for often no real good reason. And so like that, ticks with a K is no reason that should be the political capital disadvantage, but it is because debaters are really weird. So this focuses on a current bill in Congress. And so it's a great way to get the kids like really knowledgeable about what is happening in Congress right now, right? They have to be very on top of what bills will and won't pass, and that it might, not pass by a large margin. So you want a bill, specifically a legislative item, that is borderline passing. You don't want something that everyone's just going to agree to. You want something that has some tension, right? That there's debates and that it costs political capital. And so then the question is, so the affirmative is difficult. There's a reason the affirmative hasn't happened. That reason is called inherency. But why hasn't the affirmative happened? Probably because it's not super politically popular, or it would have been passed, a decade ago. And so the plan costs that political capital. And that political capital trades off with the political capital needed to pass whatever bill the uniqueness evidence talked about. And then that bill not passing is really bad. And why is that bad? What's the impact of that? And so this disadvantage is going to really come back a lot next year, and is a great way to get kids really interested and just the political process and understanding political capital and how this like horse trading and different, pork belly spinning, like how do all of these things actually function, right? They'll talk like little political analysts and know all of these terms and really be able to ask questions about political capital and the role of the president and the legislative bodies and how all those inter-party meetings work and all of that. So that's one of the, I think, joyous and fun parts of the political capital disadvantage, is it really at least got me very interested in those things. My poor parents who had to hear their 15-year-old just talk about political capital all the time. But other than the poor parents who have to listen to the kids talk about obscure political theories, it's a great way to really get them involved in the news and the political process and understanding what's going on in our nation's capital. Then kicking a DA. So this is how, as I said, how you don't go for disadvantage, right? Often a 1 in C will include multiple different disadvantages. And as I said in the 2 in R, you should only go for one of them. So what happens to the other disadvantage? Do we just forget about it? Do we just not talk about it ever again? And then the judge is like, what happened to this other disadvantage? So you should kick a disadvantage is what it's called. You should, step 1, check for any offense. Make sure there isn't offense. And if there's offense, you still have to answer it. So ask yourself, are there any turns? And if the answer is no, you're good. The answer is yes, answer them. You should answer offense, always. You should pick a source of defense that moots the whole entire disadvantage. So let's say you read a different impact in the block. You can't just concede impact defense on the first impact. You have to moot the entire disadvantage, everything you've read. So often that's on the uniqueness level, like just kidding, this thing isn't really going to happen, we made it up, or no link, not at all relevant to this debate. The affirmative doesn't cause it, it's fine, we can totally ignore this disadvantage, no way the affirmative's going to cause it, doesn't change the world. Or if you only read it in one impact, then you can do the impact defense. Like this disadvantage doesn't matter at all, so it's fine. And be sure to be very clear to the judge that you are kicking it and not going for it, to avoid any confusion and avoid the affirmative bringing it back up. Be like, they ignored this, they kicked this, so clearly we won, and that's a reason to vote for us. Make sure the affirmative can't do that. You want to, quote, shut any doors in the 2 in R, which is why you pick a good source of defense, maybe multiple pieces of defense if you want, to just really hedge your bets there. So yeah, say, I'm not going for it, I am kicking this disadvantage to the judge, and then explain the exact piece of defense or pieces of defense in which you are kicking it on. It's not enough to just say, I'm kicking this disadvantage, ignore it. You have to pick a piece of offense. Otherwise, the affirmative might pretend like, something they said was maybe some offense and try to go for it. So you don't want that. Again, shut any doors. Tell everyone that you are kicking the disadvantage. Very important that everyone's on the same page. Don't assume that a judge just picks it up. Be sure to tell them. Yeah, And that's it. Um, so yeah, I don't know if we have any questions. But yeah, that is the kind of overview with a few advanced strategies on the disadvantages. Thank you.